Welcome to our Thursday evening Bible study, and today we are talking about church history, specifically the early Middle Ages. And briefly, let me review where we've come from and where we're going. A brief review of the church organization as it had been developing in the early stages of the church and getting into the early Middle Ages. There was the Episcopal form of church government that had developed. The Episcopal form of church government was in the church's struggle with Gnosticism and Montanism and many other struggles within as well as outside the church itself. A centralized structure of church organization was formed to determine what the Bible said and to state the orthodox position of the church on many different positions, since even heretics could appeal to Scripture. So the bishops, each local congregation was led either by a team of elders or a bishop initially, or both. But as time evolved, a bishop was assigned to every location. And we learned that the bishops in the large cities became known as metropolitan bishops, and then even above them, there was the five most important cities in the empire acquired the title of patriarch. So we had the five patriarch bishops. But the Bishop of Rome gradually became recognized to be, at least by many bishops, to be even of higher authority and superior. So by the year 461, the year in which Leo the First died, the papacy had become fully established. Now the archbishops, the title archbishop came about as the centuries rolled on. There were further developments in the organization and government of the church. And in Charlemagne's time, it became the custom to call the metropolitan bishops archbishops. And so that was the new title for that position. This title, the Roman Catholic clergy of that rank still bear that title today. Now, the archbishop has jurisdiction over the other bishops within his territory. Now, Rome, in all the Roman Empire, there was no city that could compare to the city of Rome, and it was the city of the Caesars. It was the acknowledged mistress of the ancient world, and the enormous and unequal prestige of Rome was shed upon the man who held the position of bishop in the church of that city. There was a luster such as no other bishop had, and gradually it became known as the chair of St. Peter. Gradually, all the other bishops got into the habit of appealing to the bishop of the church in Rome for decisions when controversies arose. So it came about that after a while, the bishop of Rome began to put forth claims to authority over the other bishops and over the entire church. They appealed to history to prove that they had been regarded as the final court of appeal. They even claimed to have Scripture on its side. The belief grew that the Church of Rome had been founded by the Apostle Peter, and this became the foundation of the papacy. The papal throne is often referred to as the chair of St. Peter. Even in history, or events in history, strengthened the papacy. Circumstances, in a remarkable way, favored the growth of papal power. The whole chain of historical events within the church, within and without the church, within and outside the church, the whole chain of historical events of that time seemed to lead to a gathering of authority in the bishopric of Rome. First of all, the barbarians who invaded Italy had come under the spell of Rome. They had accepted Christianity, many of them, many of them accepted Christianity and stood in awe of the bishops of Rome. When the emperor was unable to protect the people, the unarmed bishop of Rome had been able to shield them with a certain extent, to a certain extent, from the worst excesses of the barbarians. Pope Leo the First had been able to restrain, in a measure at least, the fierce Huns and Vandals. And the importance of 476 cannot be overstated. This is the importance of 476, the fall of Rome, and how it impacted papal authority. The destruction of the Roman Empire by the Germanic barbarian invaders gave a tremendous boost in papal power and prestige. There was no longer an emperor in Rome to overshadow the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome now held the most important office in the entire West. And they began to send out missionaries, or they continued to send out missionaries, I should say, through the work of missionaries sent out from the Roman Church. Churches were founded among many tribes in the north of Europe. Great missionaries such as Boniface, the Apostle of Germany, through him, and he had stood he had stood in very close relation to the Bishop of Rome, and he had carried on his missionary work in his name. And the churches founded through the labors of Roman missionaries naturally regarded with gratitude the Bishop of Rome, which had sent these missionaries out to them. Muslim conquest, again, I'm talking about the circumstances. I'm sorry, I lost my place here briefly. Events in history that strengthened the papacy. First of all, the circumstances such as the barbarians, the fall of Rome, the missionaries, and another one was the Muslim conquest. Muslim conquest ended the patriarch bishopric. So the Muslim conquest of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt removed forever the patriarch bishoprics of Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, those three at least, as rivals to the Bishop of Rome. The Muslim conquest of North Africa also removed the Bishop of Carthage, which also seemed to be a strong bishopric previously and somewhat a rival to Western authority to the Bishop of Rome. The church had suffered from grave disasters, but those very disasters brought increasing power and authority to the head of the church in Rome. They all had the tendency to elevate in the eyes of men the bishops of the church, the bishops of Rome, to the headship of the entire church. So papal power was aided by deceit. The papacy was aided by the scheming efforts of many men. Through deceit and fraud, they succeeded in strengthening the Pope's position and authority. Two specific instances will show how deceit was used to accomplish this. First of all, a document called the Donation of Constantine. Around the time of Charlemagne, there appeared a strange document. It told that the Emperor Constantine was cured of leprosy through the prayers of Pope Sylvester. And upon Constantine getting healed, out of gratitude to the Pope, decided to remove his residence from Rome more than 1,000 miles east of there to Byzantium, the city which is now called Constantinople, or it later became known as Constantinople. His object in doing this, according to the document, was that the secular government of the empire might not affect the spiritual government of the Pope. And on leaving Rome, according to this document, Constantine ordered that all office holders in the church be subject to the Pope Sylvester the First, and to his successors upon the papal throne. Furthermore, he transferred the city of Rome and all its provinces, districts, and cities of Italy and of the western regions. So, according to this document, Constantine bestowed upon the popes sovereignty over the western half of the empire. According to this document, the donation of Constantine. The other document was called the Isidorian Decretals. The Isidorian Decretals, around the middle of the 9th century, there appeared a second mysterious document. The word decretals means decisions, and were said to have been a collection by Isidore of Seville. The document, which he was a famous bishop in Spain, very influential. I think we talked about him probably last time. But this document consisted of decisions and councils from Clement of Rome in the 1st century to Gregory II in the 8th century. Bishops, according to this document, could appeal directly to the Pope on any issue. And neither bishops nor popes were subject to the control of any secular government, according to the Isidorian Decretals. The donation of Constantine was included within the Isidorian Decretals. Now, there was a hierarchical system that the whole hierarchical system, the system of rulers, even subject to the one immediately above, was the result of a growth extending over several centuries. The Isidorian Decretals represented it as something complete and unchangeable from the beginning. The great purpose of this document was to show that all the rights claimed by the popes in the 9th century had been exercised by the popes from the earliest times, which certainly was not true. But two men came to the rescue. We could say to the rescue: Nicholas de Cusa and Lorenzo Valla. I don't know if I'm pronouncing those correctly, but I think I'm probably pretty close. For 400 years, these documents were accepted as at face value, regarded as genuine. Nicholas de Cusa in 1453 was the first to suggest that these documents were forgeries. The Isidorian Decretals then came to be called the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, pseudo meaning false. In 1440, Lorenzo Valla proved that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. So today, even Catholic scholars agree with Protestant scholars that both these documents were fabricated and a sham. Fictional documents were nothing new, though. But these two were among the most colossal frauds ever carried out, and the time when they were thrust upon the world was an age of extreme ignorance. And so through the medieval centuries, these forgeries were generally accepted as genuine. This gave the papacy sufficient time to establish, promote, and entrench itself to an extreme. And then there was the East-West split in the church. After the Muslims invaded and took complete control over 3 of the 5 patriarchs in the 7th century, there were only 2 patriarchs left. That was Constantinople and Rome. But the Patriarch of Constantinople refused to recognize the Pope as his superior. So the Pope, the bishop in Rome, excommunicated the Patriarch in Constantinople. In turn, the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope. So this led to the split in 1054 The eastern and western parts of the church formal, formally separate. The Bishop of Rome, now known as the Pope, was supreme in the west, and the Patriarch of Constantinople was extreme in the east. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that next week or in some future session. But we're still a little bit before that. Let's back up a little bit to the 9th century again, the tail half of the 9th century. Pope Nicholas the First. We're talking about the early Middle Ages today, and really getting into what is known as the Dark Ages, the worst of the worst, the midnight of the Dark Ages, we could say. Pope Nicholas I, he occupied the papal throne from 858 to 867, and he did much to lay the foundation of the papal power and prestige in the following centuries. The writings of St. Augustine had great influence throughout the Middle Ages. The book City of God was the inspiration of the Emperor Charlemagne. The book City of God likewise made a deep impression on the mind of Pope Nicholas I, as well as many others. It was his ambition to apply the ideas of the life of his day, the ideas of that book to the life of his day. He believed that the bishops are the agents of the Pope. He believed likewise that the Pope is the ruler of the entire church. He believed that the church was superior over earthly powers, and he was able to make good his claims for the papacy only to a very limited extent. But he left those claims behind as an ideal, after which later popes were to strive. The popes who came closest to fulfilling it were Gregory VII and Innocent III. No pope ever made greater claims to papal power than did Nicholas I. But during this time, in the early Middle Ages and through the Dark Ages, Europe was in disorder. In 843, the empire of Charlemagne was divided among his three grandsons. He obtained the land east of the Rhine, known in history as the East Frankish Kingdom. This was the beginning of Germany. Another of his grandsons took the land to the west. This was known as the West Frankish Kingdom. It included roughly what's now France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And the third grandson obtained the land in the middle, the long but narrow strip of land between the east and the west. It included Italy, and it became known as the Middle Kingdom or the Kingdom of Italy. Europe was again plunged into disorder. Charlemagne had created order out of chaos, but his successors did not succeed in protecting their people from new enemies that now appeared. The Slavs and the Hungarians, upon their fleet of horses, attacked from the east. The Scandinavians from Scandinavia came the wild Norsemen in their swift ships. They sailed up the rivers and made landings in the Netherlands and France. Being heathen, they took special delight in burning churches, plundering and burning churches and monasteries. And they also murdered many of the inhabitants. For 300 years, there rose from the Christian lands of Europe the prayer, Lord, deliver us from the Norsemen. Out of this disorder, out of the disorder of these times arose feudalism. Now, so feudalism develops. The knowledge of feudalism is necessary to understand the church in the Middle Ages. For a large part of the Middle Ages, people of West Europe lived their lives under feudalism due to the invasion of the barbarians there were no large cities in the early Middle Ages. Most people lived in the country, and the land was the chief form of wealth. Feudalism was a system based upon a peculiar way of holding land, and I'm not going to do it justice trying to explain it, but basically, for our purposes, it's simply the dividing of the land, dividing the kingdom. Now, the kings who succeeded Charlemagne soon discovered that they were not able to protect themselves and their kingdoms against the invading barbarians. As a security measure, each of these kings divided his kingdom into smaller countries, and the king's leading warriors were given charge of smaller countries on the condition that they give him military aid whenever called upon to do so. On the same conditions, each of these newly made princes would divide each of his estates among lesser nobles, and these nobles in turn would grant sections of their land to lesser tenants, and so on down. So it became a system of vassals and fiefs. Those who received the land upon the condition of military aid and service were called vassals. The vassals might in turn give some of their land that he had received to others on the same terms, but the land which was held upon these conditions became known as fiefs. And I mean, you can do research to find out more. I'm not adequately explaining it, I'm sure. Everyone in Europe was brought into the feudal system. It frequently happened that pious people gave land to churches and monasteries. Bishops and archbishops and abbots in that way became landowners. This also brought them into the feudal system. At last, everybody in Europe was in the feudal system in one way or another. Emperors looked upon the popes as their vassals. In fact, a fact which foreshadowed serious trouble for the church. Feudalism was a system of mutual aid. At the top of the feudal system were men who were nobody's vassals. They were lords only. And at the bottom of the system, there were people that were not lords over anybody, but they were just simply vassals. But in the middle was a system of men who were both lords and vassals. They were lords over those below them and vassals to those who were above them. The lords were under no obligation lords were under obligation to give protection to their vassals, and vassals were obligated to give service, especially in war, to their lords. The political result of feudalism was decentralization, and that really didn't help the overall situation. There were no longer any countries unified under a strong central government, and every country in Western Europe was broken up into a large number of small principalities ruled over by nobles. These noble lords had the power of a king, each with his own domain, and that made the actual king quite weak. The king was only the chief or lord among many. If a few lords or nobles were to combine themselves, they might be stronger than the king. A number of nobles actually did sometimes combine to fight against the king, but more often than not, they were fighting among each other. They were fighting with each other. So it's not surprising that the Norse invaders had comparatively easy going into this disorganized territory. So the Norseman was the next great group of barbarians that came into the western part of Europe and invaded, and eventually became known as the Normans, but originally they were the Norsemen. Many Norsemen had returned north to Denmark and Norway. Many Norsemen never returned north to Denmark or Norway. Large bands of the Norsemen made permanent settlements in northwestern France. They quickly adapted the language, custom, and religion of the country in which they settled, which was Christianity. And once again, it becomes Christians fighting against Christians. The Norsemen, who, Christians in name at least, fighting against Christians in name at least. The Norsemen who settled in the northwestern France came to be known as Normans, and that part of France is still today known as Normandy. The Normans soon set out on military expeditions of their own. William, Duke of Normandy, invaded England in the year 1066, defeated the English in battle, the Battle of Hastings, and conquered their land. William of Normandy was also known as William the Conqueror or William the Great, the first Norman king of England. And the Normans also conquered southern Italy. Italian feudal lords control the popes for a season. Italy, like other countries of Europe, was under the feudal system. It was under feudalism, and instead of having one central government ruling over the entire country, it was split into large numbers of smaller principalities, each one ruled by some lord or noble. In the chaos, disorder, and confusion of the decentralized government, nobles and lords were feuding and fighting each other over various issues. For several generations, the feudal lords in central Italy gained the power to appoint popes. And that, no doubt, was one of the issues that they were fighting over, who could control the appointment of the pope. It's like ownership of the papacy. Which group was owning the papacy? So these Italian feudal lords were continually fighting others for supremacy. Whichever noble family gained control of Rome for a time dictated the appointment of the pope. For the popes were elected by the clergy and the people of that city and that region. Often very wicked men, unfit for office in the church, were elected popes. This was especially true during the 10th century. The 10th century, it was then that the papacy touched its lowest point. The church was in bondage to secular rulers, as never before. Often, the nobles won out. The nobles who won out deposed the pope, elevated to office by the previous noble who controlled it before, and then he would put a new man in the papal throne. In this way, the one pope followed another in rapid succession. Between the death of Stephen VI in 891 and the ascension of John the 12th in 955, there were no less than 20 popes. And this is what we call the Dark Ages. This was indeed a time of shame, disgrace, and confusion for the church. And keep in mind, most people were ignorant. There was no printing press. There was very little education. Most people were not educated. But the popes depend on the German pope, the German emperor. Okay, so once again, the pope looked longingly beyond the Alps for aid. Pope John the 12th called to Otto the First, also known as Otto the Great, the king of the Germans, to his aid. This Otto was a strong man. Many of the dukes of Germany had acted as independent sovereigns, but Otto made them his vassals. He accomplished this with the help of bishops and abbots of large monasteries. These bishops and abbots controlled exclusive landed estates. Their forces, joined with those of the king, were strong enough to put down any combination of dukes. Down to the time of Napoleon, the bishops and abbots of the Catholic Church of Germany were not temporal rulers. Otto's power as king rested upon his control over the appointment of bishops and abbots. And this is called lay investiture. Now, lay investiture was something that was impacting the church at that time too. Investiture meaning to give a man a ring or staff as a symbol for his office. And when we talk about lay investiture, basically we're talking about the layman, in this case the government. The government, whoever holds the government office, appoints the bishops and the abbots, and at this point, beginning at this point, even the Pope. So naturally, Otto always appointed bishops and abbots who were willing to support him. So this Otto the Great, Otto the First, came to the rescue for Pope John the 12th. The Pope showed his appreciation by crowning Otto emperor on February the 2nd in 962, and this restored the empire in the West, which had collapsed under the weak successors of Charlemagne. Remember, Charlemagne became the emperor of the revised Roman Empire, but after his death, it kind of fell apart. It was decentralized and became very weak. So Otto is now, he's a strong king, and now he's being crowned as the emperor of the revised Roman Empire, which became known as the Holy Roman Empire. And the empire was henceforth connected with Germany. It continued to exist until 1806, when Napoleon made an end of it. Calling Otto king of Germany to his aid, John the 12th opened a new era in the history of the papacy. Until this time, the popes had all been Italian. But now that tradition was broken. A couple generations later, actually Emperor Otto the Third placed his cousin Gregory the Fifth in the position of pope in 996. Gregory the Fifth, who had preceded. Okay, let me restate this. Okay, so Otto the Third was the emperor, and he placed his cousin Gregory the Fifth as pope in 996. Now, previously, before becoming pope, he was a chaplain. Now, Gregory the Fifth was the great-grandson of Otto the Great, and who was the first Holy Roman Emperor. Otto the Third then placed, after Gregory the Fifth died, he was only pope, I think, for 3 years. He then placed his tutor, Gerbert, Archbishop of Reims, to the papal throne in the year 999. Now, Gerbert became Sylvester II. You know, many times, I don't know when this started, but when people became popes, they would change their name. They still do that. They become something else. They change their name. This Gerbert changed his name to Sylvester II, and he was the first French pope. So Gregory V was the first German pope and the first non-Italian pope, and Sylvester II, or Gerbert, was the first French pope. But Gerbert, or Sylvester II, whichever name you choose to call him by, was the most learned man of his time. Sylvester II is known as using his position as a bully pulpit to promote education. You know, during those Middle Ages, and especially in the Dark Ages, most people were very uneducated. Only priests and people connected with the monastery received a reasonable amount of education. Sylvester II is said to also be the person to introduce the decimal numerical system to Europe. And then simony. Simony is another big issue in the Middle Ages and in the Dark Ages. It's based upon Simon the sorcerer in Scripture, the buying and selling of spiritual gifts, as it was in the Bible. But when we speak of simony connected with church history, we're talking about the buying and selling of church offices. Sometimes church offices would go to the highest bidder. This would be true of positions such as abbots, bishops, and perhaps even political offices, but also it even happened with the papacy. So the church was once again plunged into the depths of disgrace. The Italian party, the nobles of the Tuscan family, which happened to be in control at the time, made Benedict the Ninth Pope in the year 1033. Now, Benedict was only 12 years old at the time, and he turned out to be the worst of all the popes. He turned out to be one of the worst, and I want to read in closing just a little bit about this guy. This Benedict was only 12 years old at the time, and he turned out to be one of the worst characters to ever occupy the papal seat. His conduct was so bad that the nobles the nobles of the Crescencio family, who were the rivals of the Tuscan party, were able to, in the year 1045, to drive him out of Rome. In his place, they made Sylvester III Pope. Soon, however, Benedict came back and resumed the pontificate. But after a time, he grew tired of it and brazenly sold the office of Pope for £1,000 of silver to a man known as Gregory VI. This sinful practice of giving and obtaining an appointment to a church office for money is called simony. News of this shameful transaction leaked out. There was a loud outcry. As a result, Benedict refused to surrender the papal office in which he had sold. There were now three popes: Sylvester III, Benedict IX, and Gregory VI. There were three popes at one time due to the circumstances. And this was the church of which all Christians are descendants. Both Protestants and Catholics should grieve over these days. And we'll close with that. Thanks for joining me, and we'll continue next week. God bless you.